Very good afternoon, learners. And it is a pleasure to interact with you again after, I think, a gap of a month or so. And today's presentation is going to be from your course MSD 13, which concerns socio-cultural system. We'll be looking at some issues from block 4, which is basically concerned with developmental pathways, equity, and social justice. And today we shall be talking about the principles of equity and social justice. We'll be basically looking at these two concepts and trying to understand how they relate to the idea of environmental justice, how the idea of sustainability, in a sense, really does not make any sense until we talk about these two very, very important issues of equity and social justice. So we'll be repeatedly discussing our understanding of the very concept of sustainability through the lens of these two very, very important principles of equity and social justice. So, like I've just indicated, environment, development, and sustainability are very, very closely related with the notions of equity and social justice. Environment is something that concerns all of us, that all of us are dependent upon, that all of us derive our sustenance from. However, if we look at the history of the world, and if we look particularly at the recent contemporary history of development, of huge economic growth, we will find that environmental degradation, environmental pollution, these phenomena are basically the product of economic growth. And this economic growth is not an equitable growth. It is growth which is concentrated in very limited hands. However, the consequences of this environmental degradation are very, very unfairly borne or unfairly suffered by those sections of the population who are the most vulnerable. So this is something that I think we're all familiar with, that any mega project which includes or which involves a lot of environmental issues or a lot of issues of environmental degradation or environmental ultimately causes the maximum harm to the poorest of the people. So this is something that we have observed all over the world. And that is why when we talk about sustainability, it is very, very important to speak also about the issues of equity, equality, and social justice. I've flagged two terms, equity and equality. What do we understand by both of them? Now, equality is a term that is very familiar to you. Equality means all human beings are equal, right? All people are equal. We are all equal in the eyes of the law, and so on and so forth. So equality is a concept that is very well known to you. However, equity is a rather more nuanced concept. When we talk about equality, we mean that everybody is the same and must be treated in the same fashion. However, equity takes into account the existing discriminations and inequalities so that people are treated fairly and receive a fair deal. For instance, take a simple example. In a classroom, we may say that all children in the classroom should be treated equally. However, we tend to neglect, for example, issues like the specific discriminations and problems that is experienced by each of the children. Suppose there is a child who comes from an upper middle class home, who has got all the facilities, who has got access to all kinds of educational resources, who gets a good nutrition, who has a lot of support and emotional stability at home. Compare that particular child with another child who may be coming from a very poor background, a background where there may be a lot of violence, a background where there may not be any access to educational resources, a background where the child may be facing a good deal of malnutrition, may not be having proper facilities to study in. And then if we use a term like equality, it does tend to be a bit problematic because their circumstances are not the same. So if we say that I will treat both these children equally in the classroom, it means that somewhere or the other, the child who is facing more discrimination, the child who is facing more inequalities in terms of his life or her life, will not really get a fair deal. So when we talk about the concept of equity, it means that we have to take into consideration the specific circumstances, the specific difficulties that an individual or a community experiences. And hence, equity is a notion that has the concept of social justice well and truly inbuilt in it. So, like I mentioned, equity implies fairness and justice without any bias and discrimination. So, if we discriminate between individuals, it means that the very notion of social justice is violated. So, I've quoted from Falk and others, a quote that is present in your unit also. Equity derives from the concept of social justice. It represents a belief that there are some things which people should have, that there are basic needs that should be fulfilled, that burdens and rewards should not be spread too divergently across the community, and that policy should be directed with impartiality, fairness, and justice towards these ends. So this is a very, very profound quote if you look at it very, very carefully. So see the number of layers that you can unpack in this. So for instance, the notion of equity being backed or being very, very firmly grounded in the idea of social justice. So what do we mean by social justice? By social justice, we mean that every member of society, every group in society should have access to the same goods, the same opportunities, the same life chances as everybody else. Now let's discuss this a little bit further. Suppose we say that everybody in society is absolutely equal. Now that is actually not true. We will find that there are people who may be more talented, more gifted, coming from better, economic backgrounds, coming from better, social backgrounds. So there's a wide range of diversity in society. Diversity that may derive from the individual's own qualities. So everyone cannot be a Sachin Tendulkar, for example. Everybody cannot be, a very, very world champion athlete, right? So there are certain natural qualities or natural talents that everyone may have. But for those talents to be nurtured and for those talents to flourish, you need an appropriate social environment. You need appropriate life chances. Now, because somebody who is a great cricketer, for instance, India loves cricket, so let's use that as an example. A person who's developed as a great cricketer is probably because that individual not just had the natural talent, but also got the appropriate opportunities. There may be so many young children all over the country who may be brilliantly talented, but because they did not get the proper opportunities, were not able to fulfill their potentialities. So equity derives from the concept that there are, of course, basic needs that should be fulfilled in society, and that burdens and rewards should not be spread too divergently across the community. By that we mean that everybody should have a fair chance, a just chance to improve their lives, to achieve their goals, to fulfill their aspirations. And that any policy, any social policy which is rooted in the notion of social justice should be directed with impartiality, fairness, and justice towards these ends. So the goal of a society, the goal of a fair society, the goal of a society where equity is dominant is one where even the weakest individual can flourish. The strong individual will always flourish, but we have to think in terms of how weaker, less powerful individuals can also get a fair deal in society. And obviously, this is something which is very, very closely linked with the idea of sustainability. You have already studied in your other classes, in your other units, in your other courses, how sustainability basically refers to a notion of development which has quality, equity, and justice built in it. And sustainability means that because these values of justice, because these values of taking people, taking everybody on board, because these values are implicit in the idea of sustainability, therefore the kind of developmental pathways that sustainability implies are participative ones, are pathways which take along everybody in society. So this is very, very important to keep in mind. Equity means giving people what rightfully belongs to them and recognizing the specific as well as diverse conditions of each individual. I just explained this point earlier. Let's talk about two concepts which are discussed in your unit, the notion of intragenerational and intergenerational equity. So very simply, intragenerational equity means equitable access of resources within the current generation. Okay, so across people, across people living in the same generation, what are the opportunities available for economic advancement? What are the opportunities available for social participation, political participation? What are the opportunities available for each gender, for each social class? What is our policy? What are our programs vis-a-vis poverty eradication and so on and so forth? Inequities and inequality, wealth, access to resources, exposure to environmental hazards, pollution, etc. All these constitute our understanding of what we mean by intragenerational equity. So is it that certain populations or certain groups, certain communities are more exposed to environmental hazards? We see that is very much the case. If you look at the history of environmental man-made disasters, industrial accidents that have taken place, whether it is the recent incident in Visakhapatnam or whether it is the highly documented, the very, very well documented cases of Bhopal in 1984 and Chernobyl, we find that there are certain sections of the population which have been exposed in a very, very, awful way to these environmental hazards. Similarly, if we look at pollution, we find that pollution, which those of us who live in the city of Delhi, we encounter it every year in winter. And although this is pollution which is created by a multiplicity of factors, including, excessive use of fossil fuels and so on, who are the people who bear the brunt of this pollution the most? We will find that it is the vulnerable sections of the population who bear this the most. Those who may not have access to safe homes where they can be, where they can be within the four walls while pollution is at its peak. Those individuals who are working outside, who are homeless, who are sleeping under the flyovers, who are doing manual work, these are the people who are most negatively impacted by these hazards, which have been, in a sense, created by the wealthier sections. We also see the huge gap between rural and urban, developed and developing nations, and we'll come to that in a minute. Let's speak about intergenerational equity. Now, the very notion of sustainability, the famous definition of sustainability, which is using the resources in this generation in a sustainable manner so that the future generations can also benefit of these resources. So we see that an intergenerational concept is inbuilt within the notion of sustainability itself. So intergenerational equity means that resources should be distributed in such a way that even the future generations will receive the same natural and cultural resources that the present generation has access to or has enjoyed. We see many films, recent films, I can't recall the name immediately, in which you see very scary scenarios, science fiction scenarios of a future generation where the environment is so terribly depleted, where climate change has completely destroyed the world, where all the cultural and natural resources that this generation has enjoyed have been destroyed due to unsustainable lifestyles, due to conflicts between nations, due to wars, nuclear hazards and holocausts, and so on and so forth. So this is a very nightmarish kind of scenario that creative people have written about. But even though these are examples of creative writing or of popular culture, we find that there is a certain scientific validity, or they do derive from certain very strong scientific notions about the way in which we are systematically and in a very unscrupulous way destroying the resources of our planet to fulfill our own selfish ends and really not thinking about what the future generations will have to suffer. To bring it to the present context, we see, for instance, that this entire current scenario vis-a-vis COVID-19, there has been so much discussion and so much reflection on the way in which so many human actions have been responsible for creating this difficult situation. And who will bear the brunt of this difficult situation? It will be the future generations. So this is something we need to think about very, very carefully. So there is a this is a concept that comes from economics, the notion of weak and strong sustainability. That is the impact of the present generation's activities on the environment inherited by future generations. So weak sustainability basically means that even though environment has been depleted, there is sufficient man-made or human-made, replacements which the next generation can draw upon. Whereas strong sustainability means that there is a greater emphasis on conserving the natural resources rather than substituting these natural resources. So naturally, within the sustainability discourse, it is strong sustainability that is more important or given a greater significance. As I've been discussing so far, what my talk has been highlighting, we see how the impact of globalization has resulted in such a terrible loss of biodiversity. You're all familiar with this, and I think earlier, speakers, earlier talks, and lectures by other teachers have emphasized this. We find monocropping, the way in which certain agricultural practices have resulted in a loss of biodiversity. This year, in fact, the theme of World Environment Day was conservation of biodiversity. So the emphasis on biodiversity or the importance of biodiversity cannot be emphasized enough. When there is biodiversity, there is sustainability. When there is biodiversity, there is also then the possibility for diversity of cultures, for diversity of human endeavors and activities also to flourish. So cultural diversity, which I had discussed in my earlier talk with you a few weeks ago, cultural diversity and biodiversity are very, very closely connected with each other. And we find that with globalization, a loss of a lot of indigenous practices, a lot of indigenous ways of doing things can be seen in the interest basically of, ramping up production, leading to huge, production of resources and production of goods and services for profit motive. So globalization has to be rethought, and we have to really carefully look at the gains and losses of globalization in a much more holistic manner. This impact of climate change and global warming. Now, this is also something that is very, very well known to you. I need not elaborate upon it in too much detail. We all know that climate change and global warming has led to very, very serious consequences. It has led to very, very serious human consequences. And it is said that the kind of climate change that we are witnessing in the current era, this is not climate change that has happened due to natural causes, as used to happen in the previous, millennia. This is human-induced climate change. This is climate change which has been impacted by human activities. And we find that the impact of climate change on so many important indices, for instance, the melting of the Arctic, the polar caps. We see rising ocean levels, warming of the oceans. We find a great deal of very dramatic changes in weather patterns, leading to all kinds of extreme climatic events. And who are the people who suffer most from these impacts or these extreme climatic events or these extreme environmental things? It is basically those sections of the population who are the most vulnerable, who really cannot protect themselves from these impacts. In the World Environment Week, the SOITS had done a series of lectures on Gyanvani on different aspects of environment. And one of the things that I discussed was the impact of environment on gender, or the interrelationship between gender and environment. And we find that when we speak of climate change, the greatest sufferers tend to be the poor and women. And poor women suffer acutely on account of climate change. This is because livelihoods are disrupted. The care of children and the aged, which is usually vested in women. Women also have to go out and, collect fuel, collect water, right? So the entire, domestic round that women do, the entire domestic responsibility that women do is very, very adversely affected by climate change events and its impact upon lifestyles and livelihoods. The impact of nuclear products and nuclear waste. I need not dwell much more in this because not only are we familiar with the kind of impact that nuclear waste and nuclear accidents have on human life, but we also know that these impacts tend to persist over generations. We are all aware that the atomic explosions in the mid-40s, which ended the Second World War, the impact of exposure to, nuclear weaponry led to impacts or led to certain terrible impacts on the future generations as well. So this tends to be an intergenerational issue wherein the activities of the present generation may continue to have adverse effects on the generations to come. Let's look at equity at the international level. What I had mentioned earlier with regard to inequality and inequity between the rich countries and the poor countries of the world, what we call the developing nations. So we find that in resource consumption and management, inequality and inequity is marked. Another related matter, which I've repeatedly referred to, is the dumping of hazardous wastes in poorer countries. We find that the activities, the economic activities of the rich countries, the deleterious effects or the ill effects of these are inequitably or unequally borne by the poorer countries. And like I just mentioned earlier, we find that the impact or the effect of climate change caused by the activities of the developed world is felt much more acutely by the poorer and less developed ones. So basically, when we talk about strategies to reduce inequity, we should take into account fair distribution of resources and of consumption. So how are resources distributed? How are consumption patterns so unequal? And then we have to try to work out strategies and plans wherein these inherent inequities are mitigated somewhat or reduced. Let's go to the very, very important notions of environmental justice, equity, and sustainability, which really, in a sense, are at the heart of our class today. So we all know that human society cannot remain in harmony when the environment is disturbed and there is a lack of distributive justice. Now, I'm using this term distributive justice for the first time. The concept of social justice is a complex concept and it includes many dimensions. However, one of the important dimensions that we can talk about when we discuss social justice is that of distributive justice. How are resources distributed to people? So you often see there is a distinction between, gross domestic product and per capita income. So the gross domestic product, the GDP, will give you an indicator of growth in an overall perspective. So countries with GDP as it is growing will give an indicator of the way the country is growing economically in terms of absolute growth. However, really, it is the per capita income which gives us a much more clear indicator of whether this increasing wealth is distributed in a more equitable manner. We find that even though there may be large growth in the absolute numbers or in the absolute wealth, how that wealth, how those goods, how those resources, how that income is distributed amongst the population really gives us a much better indicator into the existence of inequalities and whether equity is prized, whether equity is being promoted in a particular nation or in a particular society. And in this context, since we're talking about sustainability, we see that environmental justice is a very, very critical issue of equity and social justice. So what do we mean by environmental justice? Let's come to that in a minute. So if you look at the USEPA definition, you will find that environmental justice is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So environmental justice basically refers to a much more participative understanding. So it is not just enough to have laws which, regulate the way in which the environment is used or the way in which environmental misuse is regulated. But how are all people involved in these regulations, and how are all of them treated fairly? This is a very, very important indicator that we have to think of when we talk about environmental justice. And we also find the two related concepts of outcome equity and process equity. So outcome equity entails equitable distribution of environmental hazards or environmental amenities, whereas process equity entails an equitable procedure for deciding both where to site environmental hazards or amenities and on the production or the burdens that require distribution. So what do we actually mean further? What are the implications, or what are the different dimensions that constitute environmental justice? We find that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. I think this is a very, very important concept. It demands that public policy should be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, free from any form of discrimination or bias. So I've already spoken about the lack of discrimination or bias when we spoke about the concept of equity. It mandates the right to ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land and renewable resources in the interest of a sustainable planet for humans and other living things. So note that we are not just talking about human beings, we're talking about other living things, other species, whether they be plant species, animal species, and so on and so forth. So sustainability is in a sense a concept, and environmental justice is a concept that spans justice not just for human beings, but for all living beings. It also affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all people. So what we have mentioned earlier, that the interrelationship between biodiversity and cultural diversity, between environment, development, participation, right? All these, I'll just move the slide back again so you can see, all these are very, very important dimensions of environmental justice, which take into account, respect for all species, respect for Mother Earth, respect for ecological unity, economic, political, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all people. So basically, the foundational concepts in environmental justice are equity, of justice, of equality, of respect, of diversity. So all the social justice dimensions that we speak about really are encapsulated within the notion of environmental justice. And these particular points I've quoted from Monica Ramirez Andreotta in Environmental and Pollution Science. So you've studied this earlier, I think, in your earlier course material, but it's a good idea to have a look at some of these important, very, very important social movements, these very, very important environmental movements, and see how they have, in a sense, tried to grapple with the idea of social justice and equity. So earlier we spoke about economic, cultural, political self-determination of people. And we find, if we look at environmental movements in India, look at the history of environmental movements in India, we find that environmental movements here have been very, very intimately tied up with the notion of social justice. Because, as we know, the actual brunt of environmental degradation is borne by the poorest and most marginalized people. And therefore, attempts to protect the environment, to conserve the environment, these are very, very directly related with the lives and livelihoods of the most poor sections of society. So let's begin by just recalling one of the most iconic environmental movements that the world has seen, and that is the Chipko Andolan, which began in Chamoli in what is today Uttarakhand in 1973 and continued for several years, in which local people, to prevent trees from being felled for commercial use by a sports manufacturer, by a private sports manufacturer, who was given permission by the administration to fell down trees for that purpose, hugged the trees. Chipakna, we all know this. They clung onto the trees and did not allow the cutters to cut down the trees. So this is a moment, in a sense, that captured the imagination of the entire world. And if you see the literature on the Chipko movement, it is quoted, it is cited, it has been discussed all over the world. And we find that the Chipko movement was, of course, about the conservation of forests. But what was very, very important about it was the participation of the local people, the involvement of women. Frequently, when we read any literature on the Chipko Andolan, it is only the leaders, the male leaders, who are spoken about. But the real foot soldiers of this movement, the ones who really risked their lives to protect these trees, were the village women. And their role in the Chipko movement is something quite amazing. And we also find that later on, the Chipko Andolan also extended towards eradication of social evils in the various villages. This included anti-alcoholism. So there was a very, very strong social reform and an eradication of social evils also that was present within the movement. So the movement is not merely about conservation of forests. It actually took the notion of sustainability far and wide. We are also familiar with the Apico movement that happened in Andhra Pradesh. That also was a movement basically aimed towards prevention of degradation of the forests. It was aimed at, it was a fight against deforestation, and once again signaled the importance of the forest, the importance of common resources, the importance of usufructs that are obtained from the forest in the lives of local populations. The Silent Valley movement that took place in Kerala. This is another very, very important movement that has been widely written about. We also can have witnessed in the past so many years the Narmada Bachao Andolan. So basically this and several other movements like the NBA were aimed at large-scale dam projects, right? Large-scale projects in which dams, the construction of dams, was believed to, cause harm to the environment in the vicinity, as well as degrading the lands and destroying the livelihoods of the local dwellers. So here in movements like the NBA, you see this classic conflict that has always been there when we talk about environment and sustainability. The need for development, the need for large-scale economic growth and development, and the need for conservation of resources. And this debate or this discussion is an ongoing one, and it needs a much more nuanced kind of an engagement, really, to try and understand or to try and unpack the different dimensions of both. And we find that many of these movements were also aimed or were also taking into account the very, very pressing issue of displacement. Right, so what we call development-induced displacement of local populations, which is very, very serious, which has caused a lot of, stress amongst communities, which has caused a lot of unrest amongst communities, destruction of livelihoods, and so on and so forth, and ultimately also an issue of rehabilitation. How then can the state, how then can civil society rehabilitate and once again include those who have, in a sense, sacrifice their livelihoods in the name of development? How can they also get justice and equity? So these are very, very important issues that we need to think about when we speak about sustainability. So to sum up what we've been discussing so far, sustainability is possible only when environmental and social justice and equity are assured. This is a point that I have been making throughout the presentation. Equity is not the same as equality. Equity is a more nuanced, a more sophisticated concept, and it takes into account the social and the structural discriminations that are experienced by individuals and groups. Social justice lies at the very heart of equity, and society must ensure that all sections of society can fulfill basic needs and get equal life chances. Intra and intergenerational equity both are important in ensuring equity and access to resources by both the present generation as well as the future generations. With that, I'll end my talk and open this discussion for questions and your suggestions, comments, and so on. Thank you so much.